All right, well, welcome once again. It is March the 10th, so we're here for our last winter lecture. Next month, we'll start on a spring lecture, and I'll tip you off at the end of tonight's what the next topic is. And I've got topics that'll keep me busy all through the rest of the year. So we're in for a fun time. So tonight's topic is Frederick the Great, 1712 to 1786. And I was talking to Sandy and Seth earlier and talking about how an interesting couple of weeks that I've had, because I had a lot of questions about Frederick the Great. I knew the name, I knew a bit about he's king of Prussia, okay, but it's like, how did we get there? I need maps, I need genealogical charts, I need background, and so I was pursuing all of these answers to the questions I had. So you're basically going to get to just go along for the ride of what I found out about Frederick the Great. I'll give you a clue right now. One of the things that did astonish me quite some time ago, and one of the reasons why I picked him for this lecture, is he is almost an exact contemporary with George Washington. And that connection just isn't made very often. There is a connection beyond that. Washington's born in 1732, dies in 1799. He's born in 1712, dies in 1786. So their lives overlap. And we don't often think about that as well, because, Americans think all the history happened here. And we're just completely unaware that there were anything happening anywhere else in the world. So we know what happened here. We have no idea what happened elsewhere. And I've been trying to remedy that for 50 years. So I'll do some of that tonight. And we've had a little fun looking at these portraits of Frederick, because the one on the left and the one on the right were painted by painters who knew him during his lifetime. We know when, I've got the dates there when they were painted. This one, however, the one in the middle with the crazy eyes, was painted about 100 years after he died. The Germans went through a very dramatic, romantic, realistic phase in art where they were doing heroic portraits of famous people from German history. And so that's the dramatic Frederick. That's the, I'm about to go kill somebody Frederick. But, he did have those moods. So, yeah, and there's the famous one. It's actually on the cover of the biography I have over there by Anton Graf. That was painted from life. That is Frederick at 69, and just 5 years before he died. And we'll come back to that and talk about that. Interesting guy. All right, tonight's lecture is, of course, sponsored by the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. We've been around since 2004. Our mission is to promote a biblical worldview through the study of history, literature, and art. I'm a historian, so I focus on the history, but I love studying and learning about the others. And we've named the center for Francis Schaeffer, 20th century theologian and apologist. He was, in some ways, nicknamed the missionary to the intellectuals. His daughters, while they were at university in the 50s, began bringing home fellow students to the chalet in Switzerland where they lived, and out of that grew L'Abri, and they started recording his lectures and his fireside chats and his mealtime discussions. And he was incredibly broad in his interests and tastes, and an incredibly good apologist. And kids just flocked to him for 20 years in Switzerland. So, in addition to sponsoring this lecture series, Schaeffer Study Center offers a high school program. It's built around an integrated chronological study of Western civilization. We take our kids from the ancient world in the 9th grade to the 20th century, and yes, we are doing the 21st now, because it suddenly dawned on me we're a quarter of the way through the 21st century. The joke about that is, that I've seen and dearly love, but also makes me wince, is there are a lot of people walking around who believe that 1980 was 20 years ago. Don't try and explain it to them. You will only upset them. And yeah, so I hear 1980 and go, oh yeah, that was just, oh, wait. Yeah. Yes. My wife and I have been married for 48 years now. We'll have our 49th anniversary this year in August. We have 12 children, 3 sons, 9 daughters. So far, we have 22 grandchildren. My undergraduate degree is from Davidson College in North Carolina, and I have a master's from Stanford University. I've been a historian, a teacher, and an author for almost all of my life. A former college professor, former city manager here in Mount Juliet. My wife and I founded Greenleaf Press. We publish material for homeschooling families to use in teaching history and literature. And with my wife, I'm co-director of the Francis Schaeffer Study Center. So you know what's coming next. Tell me something you already know. Anything at all that you know about Frederick the Great.
He was a contemporary of Washington.
Well, yeah. Now you know. Yeah. Okay, he's king of Prussia, which raises all sorts of interesting questions. When did Prussia get a king, and when did Prussia become a country? Those were my first questions a couple weeks ago. I have the answers. All right. Well, you're not alone at all. He gets left out of American history. Nobody teaches him in American public school history courses, I can assure you. But you're going to learn something about him tonight. So our primary sources, here's the interesting thing about the primary sources, that is the stuff written by Frederick and by the people around him, are almost all in French. And I'll explain that. There is a perfectly reasonable explanation for that, but it'll come a little later. He wrote an autobiography, Histoire de mon temps, the history of my own times, in 1746. Now, he's only about halfway through his life. He's only 34 when he wrote that, but he had vivid memories of his father. He knew some of the history of his own kingdom, and so he wrote an autobiography, which we have. He wrote a pamphlet called The Anti-Machiavel, which is a philosophical critique of Machiavelli that political scientists are still reading. It is, however, in French. He wrote military treatises, instructions for his generals, and the art of war. He predates, in some ways, Clausewitz, who read him and adopted some of his writing. Clausewitz is a little bit later, a generation or two. He wrote poetry. He wrote philosophical essays, political testaments, which were instructions for his successors in the Kingdom of Prussia. There are all kinds of private documents outlining his views on governance, absolutism, and Prussia's future. So those are primary sources. And the primary letters are in the archives in Berlin. They survived World War II with almost no loss. They evacuated them outside of the city, and then they came back at the end of the war. The Russians took part of them for a while, but eventually everything got reassembled in Berlin. Oh, yes, and he wrote in 1750, he wrote a multi-volume history of the House of Brandenburg. It's like, when did the guy have time to do anything else? Other primary sources. There's a collection of his politische Korrespondenz, a massive collection of official letters and dispatches, now in 48 volumes, published over 60 years by scholars in Germany. And then there's his Privat Korrespondenz, which is 11 volumes, family letters, private exchanges with famous correspondents like Voltaire, D'Alembert, Euler, and Rousseau. And he's not just name dropping. He had, I think there are 600 or 700 letters that he wrote to Voltaire, and an equal number that came back. So, very interesting guy. Prussian State Archives. All the official documents of the Kingdom of Prussia are still there, and at some point we'll get to the question of why is there no longer any part of Germany that is called Prussia? Because there's not. They have 16 states that are, and it's a federal republic modeled on the U.S. They have 16 states. None of them is named Prussia. We'll talk. Secondary sources. There is a fabulous biography that I have not read, but I've perused it. Thomas Carlyle, 6 volumes on Frederick the Great. Gerhard Ritter, in German, but it is translated into English, 1936, wrote a biography of him. Nancy Mitford in 1970. Robert Asprey in 1986. This guy has been, and these are all scholarly works by historians, PhD-trained historians. Dennis Showalter, The Wars of Frederick the Great, because he was engaged in at least 3 major wars in Central Europe. David Fraser wrote a biography in 2000. That's the one over here. And it is wonderful, but it's thick. I did read that one. And then the most recent one is Tim Blanning. And I've got that one here. Penguin published on Frederick the Great. It's quite good, if a little quirky at times, and a little dry, and a little of, I got to go look at a map. I don't know what he's talking about. I got to find these places because these names don't mean anything to me. Well, it turns out a lot of the place names are places that have disappeared from the map of Europe and been replaced because those cities are now in Poland or the Czech Republic, or some are even in Russia. So here we go. Frederick in context. Let me get over here. So this is a timeline going from left to right. And I've done separate rows for England, France, Russia, Prussia, Austria. And I put in George Washington down here at the bottom. So this block represents the life of George Washington. These are the dates of rule. So he's born in 1712, but he rules as King of Prussia from 1740 to 1786. So you see his contemporaries are Louis XV, George II, and George III in England, Maria Theresa in Austria, and Elizabeth and Catherine in Russia. So this guy's living in interesting times, to say the least. So here's my plan. This is what I settled on. I like 5-act plays. So I divided tonight up into 5 acts. How Brandenburg became Prussia. And the second act is Frederick's father and his youth. And this is deliberate on my part because I am just firmly convinced, having done a lot of biographies, and I've written 2 volumes, I'm working on a 3rd and a 4th of short biographical sketches. 2 things: you cannot understand a historical figure unless you understand the geography and the genealogy. You have to place them in their family and their parents and grandparents, maybe even great-grandparents, and you have to place them physically. Where were they? So the geography and the genealogy, and that's why I went back and said, well, how did Brandenburg become Prussia? Brandenburg ought to be familiar to you because we talked about Brandenburg when we did Frederick the Wise. Brandenburg is one of the 4 electors, the 4 secular electors. You have 3 bishops and 4 secular electors, and Brandenburg is one of those 4. So it's those 7 people are the ones who, for hundreds of years, elected the Holy Roman Emperor. So Brandenburg's a big deal. Well, okay, how do we get from Brandenburg to Prussia? That was my question 2 weeks ago. And we'll talk about Frederick's father and his youth because there's another quote I dearly love by Wordsworth. The child is father to the man. If you want to understand a historical figure, start by learning as much as you can about their childhood. Because the childhood of a famous historical figure, man or woman, shapes who they are and explains a lot of the rest of their life. If you know what their childhood was like, you will then understand the rest of their life a whole lot better. And I found that to be particularly true with Frederick. We'll talk about his life and military campaigns because that's where he became the great. He took the Prussian army and achieved incredible victories against what seemed on paper at first to be much more powerful neighboring countries. He won, he increased the territory of Prussia. Talk about his court and influence because he was more than just a general, more than just a king. He loved playing the flute, he loved philosophy, he loved corresponding with philosophers. He built the first freestanding opera house in all of Europe, in Berlin. There had been opera houses already in Italy and in France, but they were actually using church buildings for the opera performances. And he built the first building that was purpose-built for the performance of opera. And he hired Christoph? He hired Johann Sebastian Bach's son as a court musician, and he was visited by Johann Sebastian Bach, a very famous, that's the 3rd book here. Evening in the Palace of Reason. Bach meets Frederick the Great in the Age of Enlightenment. And this is a brilliant book. These two, if you're interested in history, these are good, solid biographies. If you want something that's a little more intriguing and broader in scope and in speculation, I recommend this one. It is quite good, and I have referred back to it a number of times since I first read it. It's one of the reasons why I was interested in finding out more about Frederick. And then finally, the connections between Prussia and the American Revolution, because they're very tight, very important. So how Brandenburg became Prussia, Act 1. Well, 1356, Brandenburg is one of the 4 secular electors of the Holy Roman Empire. So it's Brandenburg, Saxony, Bohemia, and the Palatinate of the Rhine. Those are the 4. Those 4, plus the 3 archbishops, elect the emperor whenever that office is vacant. In 1525, the Duchy of Prussia was first created as a territorial entity. And its origins are in the Teutonic Knights. Now, this one, not recently, I knew about the Teutonic Knights, but when I first looked into them many moons ago, I was startled to discover the nature of that organization. It was a monastic order of knights. There are 3 or 4 of these. The Templars in Jerusalem are another one. The Teutonic Knights were the German answer to the Templars, and their founding does go back to the Crusade era. So they took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, but they were knights. They were sent out not just as missionaries, but to defend Christians wherever Christians were under attack. For the Teutonic Knights, that was the Slavic territories to the east of the empire. The Slavic territories were still pagan. And so there were missionary bishops going out, and often they were martyred, often they were attacked, and so the Teutonic Knights sort of went along as their bodyguards, and then wound up, the Teutonic Knights had their own territory that they ruled, administered, collected taxes in, with its own capital in Königsberg. And that area was called Preußen, Prussia. The head of the Teutonic Knights of the order was profoundly influenced by Martin Luther. When Luther began the Reformation, one of the people who picked up his writings, of course, Luther's having an impact. He begins a critique of the whole institution of monasticism. He doesn't think the perpetual vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience make any sense. The whole edifice and institution of monasticism can't be found anywhere in the New Testament or the teachings of Jesus. And so he kind of says, this is all nuts. The monks ought to go home to their families. And then he married a nun. So the head of the Teutonic Knights gets Luther's pamphlets, Luther's theology, reads them and goes, he's right. And he converts and becomes a Protestant, a follower of Luther. And he secularizes the order. He doesn't leave the order of Teutonic Knights. He says, yeah, we're done. I'm releasing everybody from their vows. He actually arranges with the King of Poland, because it's outside the empire, to convert what had been the territory ruled by the master of the Teutonic Knights into a hereditary duchy ruled by him. He gets married, has children, and now you have, from the old territory of the Teutonic Knights, the Duchy of Prussia. I'll show you where that is here in just a minute. 1618, Elector John Sigismund of Brandenburg. Remember, he's the elector. And the capital of Brandenburg is Berlin. So John Sigismund of Brandenburg inherited the Duchy of Prussia because the last descendant of the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order died without any children. I take it back, it's not true. Died without a son. He had a daughter. And his daughter married the Elector of Brandenburg, and then the Elector of Brandenburg became Elector of Brandenburg, Duke of Prussia. So Brandenburg, Prussia is a thing for a while. That's too long. So eventually it gets abbreviated to Prussia. But its roots are much further east. Its roots are not around Berlin. John Sigismund's grandson, Frederick William, grew the combined territories of Brandenburg and Prussia through the final phase of the 30 Years' War. and starts to connect some of the pieces. There are intervening territories that are not part of Brandenburg or Prussia. There's sort of one nobleman who rules both territories, but they haven't really been completely integrated or united yet. So here's what that looks like as a sort of hereditary. Here's John Sigismund, Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia. His wife is Anna of Prussia, the daughter of the last male head of Prussia. Their son is George William. He's Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia. He marries Elizabeth Charlotte of the Palatinate. Their son is Frederick William, Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia. He's called the Great Elector because he further expanded and integrated the territories. And then we have Frederick III, because there are a couple more Fredericks back before John Sigismund, Elector of Brandenburg and Duke of Prussia. Those are his titles. And he arranges for the emperor to grant him the title of king. He wants to be king. He wants that title. He doesn't want to be just a duke and an elector. He wants to be king. The emperor said, and the emperor is willing to do it because he needs troops for a military campaign. So he grants the title of king to Frederick III, but it's not king of Prussia. It's king in Prussia, because Prussia's outside the empire. And then, of course, he changes his name from Frederick III to Frederick I, because he's the first king. So just to confuse future historians, I scratch my head going, wait a minute, Frederick, which Frederick is this? Frederick III or Frederick I? And I go, oh, wait, it's the same guy. So he becomes Frederick I, king in Prussia. He's married to Sophia Charlotte of Hanover. You know where the Hanoverians also end up? On the throne of England. Frederick William I, I don't know why they keep recycling these names, but now we get Frederick William I, and he's called the first because this Frederick William is Duke of Prussia, the Great Elector. This Frederick William is the first king in Prussia, the first king with that name. So to even more confuse you, you don't only have one guy who's Frederick I and Frederick III, now you have two Frederick Williams, and this one has got the numeral 1 after his name, but he's not the first one. His grandfather had been Frederick William, but his grandfather didn't have the title king, so he's Frederick William I, king of Prussia. Actually, he's still king in Prussia. Then we have Frederick II. This, by the way, is Frederick the Great's father. So then we have Frederick II, who finally transforms it from king in Prussia to king of Prussia. And he is 1713 to 17... Oh, sorry. Yeah, 1713 to 1740. Oh, no, that's not right. I copied that. Those dates are wrong. That's Frederick II. We know him as Frederick the Great, because it's easier to remember than Frederick II. All right, this is back in 1356. This is back from our lecture about Frederick the Wise of Saxony, one of the 4 secular electors. So Saxony is this tangled, overlapping territory along in here. Duchy of Munich, but he's not an elector. Here is the Electorate of Brandenburg, right up here. Berlin would be about in here somewhere. And over here you see the Teutonic Order. That's what eventually became Prussia. When the Teutonic Order, when the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order converts to Lutheranism and secularizes his territory and gets the title of Duke. Here we go. This is the slide from last month. So the 4 secular rulers, Margrave of Brandenburg, Duke of Saxony, King of Bohemia, Count Palatine of the Rhine, whose capital is actually in Heidelberg, but he has territory over here on the border of Bohemia. And then our 3 archbishops from the Rhineland area. So that's the little council of 7 that sits above all of the other nobilities in Germany. So we're concerned here about how did this become Prussia, because that is what became Prussia, the Margrave of Brandenburg. So here's Brandenburg, Prussia in 1618, and here you can see the pieces. So here's the old Margrave of Brandenburg. Here's Prussia over here. By the way, that's now half in Poland, half in Russia. That's originally Prussia. And they also have some territories over here on the Rhineland that they've inherited and gotten by marriage and trade and whatever. But it's kind of this is not atypical for the German nobility to have scattered territory that they control. Kingdom of Brandenburg, Prussia in 1700, again, and I did this map so you could see it in relation to the rest of Europe. Germany looks like a mess, because it is. France, Spain, Portugal, England, Scotland, 1700. But you see, Brandenburg, Prussia is starting to sort of stand out a bit. It is a regional player. It's not just one of the four electors. It's starting to have territory and an income, economic activity that puts it at the center of things. Here's the growth between 1600 and 1799. So again, the blue are the original two pieces. And they picked up this and this and this and this, Silesia, Pomerania, yes, Cleve, Mark, Ravensburg, Magdeburg. And at the end, they have this rather impressive physical kingdom. And it's half inside the Holy Roman Empire and half outside. For a while, they are feudal. They owe feudal homage to the King of Poland for the territory outside the empire. By 1793, yeah, if we put it all together and shade it all the same way. So here's Saxony, here's Bohemia, here two of the other electors, and now here is Brandenburg, Prussia. So that's how Brandenburg became Prussia, by marriage and consolidation and annexation. That's the Kingdom of Prussia, 1793. And they still have their own little divisions inside, because part of it is inside the empire. That heavy black line is the empire. So the Kingdom of Prussia, South Prussia, New East Prussia, and that's the Kingdom of Poland. The Electorate of Saxony, the King of Bohemia.
What language are they speaking?
Oh, this is German. Yeah, all of this map is a German map. So Dänemark is Denmark. Ostsee is the Eastern Sea. It's the Baltic.
The people at the top.
Oh, they speak German. The Teutonic Order, essentially, the Teutonic Order was protecting German bishops who had established settlements and had tried to convert the Slavic peoples here. They recruited settlers and farmers to come and establish agricultural institutes over here and agricultural estates. So this Kingdom of Prussia, South Prussia, there's a Slavic minority that's never completely assimilated, but most of these people are Germanic in origin. They have come from and are descended from settlers who came from further to the west. So there's an eastern migration. It's like, go east, young man. Go east, you can stake a claim and cut down the forests and plow up the field, and you'll have a farm and land of your own. So there's an encouragement for people to move and settle in this area. And the Slavs are pushed further to the east. And that's a centuries-old tension between the Germans and the Slavs. Still being played out today, believe it or not. So, let's talk about Frederick the child and Frederick the teenager, because that'll explain a lot. From birth to 6, he was raised by his mother, his older sister, and a Huguenot governess/nanny. And these women spoke exclusively French with each other. which was a language scorned by his father. His father didn't speak French, and he thought the French, His father was not an intellectual. His father, I don't think, ever cracked a book. His father was a general, and had worked very hard to increase the size and the capabilities of the Prussian army. At one point, he sent out word all over Europe he wanted to recruit soldiers from every nation of Europe, especially the German territories, provided they were at least 6 feet tall. So he had an entire company of soldiers, his personal bodyguards, who were all 6 feet tall or taller. At 7, Frederick was transferred to military training. His father said, "You must learn to be a soldier, my son," under the direction of 2 officers of the Prussian army, and he was also assigned a Huguenot tutor to continue his education. But the father really didn't think much of the Huguenot tutor, but he still has someone to speak French with, Jacques Duhan, and because the Huguenots, by the way, had been run out of France by Louis XIV. He had revoked tolerance. Huguenot is just a French Protestant. And Louis XIV had revoked the Edict of Toleration and told the Huguenots, you either have to convert back to the Roman Catholic Church or you can leave. So several 100,000 of them left. A lot of them went to Prussia. Duhan assisted Frederick in acquiring a secret library of books, all in French. 3,000 books in his own private secret library that he didn't tell his dad about. And his dad threatened, when he found them, he threatened to burn them all. And his mother secretly arranged for music lessons. So he's out there drilling with the military companies during the day, reveille at 6:30. But, after 5:30, he's free to do whatever he wants, and he would kind of sneak off. And his mother had brought in a music master. He apparently was quite a brilliant musician. He discovered the flute when he was about 10 and said, "That's the instrument I want." And he became a concert-level flautist, much to the chagrin of his father. He's like, he and his dad. Yeah. So after 10 years of harsh military training in 1830, he's 18 years old. You know what teenagers are like at 18? Anybody have any experience with 18-year-old teenagers? Yeah. Frederick decided he had it up to here with the 6:30 reveilles and the military training every day and the, learning to fight and learning combat warfare and all this stuff. He attempted to run away to England. He was caught because apparently, teenagers have these grand schemes and they're usually not very good at carrying them out. So he was very quickly detected and caught. One of his accomplices was executed, one of his friends who had been trying to help him get away to England. And it was extremely traumatic. Frederick, for about a year, was kept a prisoner and then had to go through a very elaborate and humiliating reconciliation with his father where he said he was extremely sorry and begged forgiveness and was restored to his military company, and then apparently threw himself into mastering at that point military training and military skills, and actually was promoted, became a colonel, and in his 20s. All right, Act 3, Scene 1. His father dies, 1740. He's 28. At that point. He's been reconciled and serving in the army. Upon the death of his father, he immediately decides that he's going to put his military training into action. He mobilizes the Prussian army and they attack an Austrian territory, Silesia, which is south of Brandenburg, Prussia, because the Austrian emperor, Charles VI, had died that same year. His father died and the Austrian emperor died that same year. The Austrian emperor is succeeded by a daughter. He has no male heir. And Frederick's like, oh, this will be a piece of cake. Not only that, but at 28, his father, because his father's favorite pastime was hunting. And he was not a patron of the arts. He wasn't spending money to subsidize court musicians. He wasn't living extravagantly. He didn't have large banquets. He liked to go out to his hunting lodge and hunt. When he died, he left Frederick with a treasury full of barrels of silver that he had accumulated and saved from the revenues of all the territories. He had a huge surplus that had been piled up. The stark contrast was when the emperor in Austria died, his empire was bankrupt. The Habsburg lands in Austria had borrowed money. They had actually come to Berlin to borrow from the bankers in Berlin, and they were bankrupt. And his army was kind of dilapidated and worn out. He had a smaller army than the Prussians. So here's poor Maria Theresa, and Frederick says, time to expand. So he invaded Silesia December 16th, 1740, won key battles in the spring of the next 2 years. Molwitz, Chotuzic, Hohenfriedberg, and Zor, and I'm probably butchering those names, they're all in Poland now. Silesia is in Poland now. Breslau was the capital of the province of Silesia. It's now Wrocław in Poland. So yeah, he secured Silesia through treaties at, there's Breslau, Wrocław now, and Dresden. The Austrians were forced to just capitulate and say, okay, fine, you can have it. When he returned to Berlin in December of 1745, so by the grand scheme of historical things, it's a relatively short and very successful campaign. He is hailed as the Great. This is why he's Frederick the Great, because he launched this attack. He's 28 years old. And although he's a little halting at the first battle doesn't go all his way, but he eventually prevails. The next 3 or 4 battles, he learned from his experiences and got better and better at it. He got better at reading maps, he got better at writing orders, he got better at utilizing his cavalry and his infantry and coordinating. And so by the end, the Prussian army is to be feared. They are battle-hardened, very well drilled, accomplished, very confident. And they love Frederick. Der alte Fritz. And they would do anything for Frederick. So by the time he comes back to Berlin in 1745, he's 33 at this point, and he is hailed as Friedrich der Größte, Frederick the Great. During that war in Silesia, it's when he builds the opera house. So he can multitask. And here's a map that sort of shows you the main conflict areas. So here's Prussia. Brandenburg they just now dropped Brandenburg. They're now just calling all of their territory Prussia. He's the king of Prussia. And here's Silesia. So you go up this river, and it's a very rich area in terms of mining, and some of the early attempts to mechanize. We're not quite at the Industrial Revolution yet. That's sort of after 1800. But this is an area of manufacturing because you've got the river for easy transport and to also run water-powered machinery. And it's very rich in minerals, iron and silver primarily. So yeah, that now is part of Prussia. And it's kind of like a dagger. 'Cause here's Vienna, and here's Silesia. There's fighting in here. The French jump into the battle because they sense the weakness of the Austrians. But Frederick's the clear winner in all of this. There's the Staatsoper in Berlin, built in only 2 years. Oh, and this cathedral in the background, Frederick the Great built that too. Beautiful cathedral, but very much a mid-18th century. It's the style of architecture is Greek and Roman classical revival. It's not Gothic. It's Palladio. This is the same era as Jefferson's architectural constructions in the U.S., so the same influences are being utilized here. And you can see this is, again, classical. It's got a facade like a Greek temple and a gorgeous performance space inside. Building still standing, was damaged during World War II, but then restored. Still the State Opera House in Berlin and one of the top venues in Europe. All right. The 7 Years' War. We know about this war, but we have a different name for it. Because in Europe, it's the 7 Years' War. part of that war was fought in our backyard. In our backyard, it's the French and Indian War. But that's a spillover from the conflict that's going on in Europe that Frederick got involved in. Actually, Frederick started the war. Yeah, what can I say? So it's the French and Indian War for us. It's the 7 Years' War. And in some ways, this is the first war that spills out of Europe into the rest of the world. There is conflict in North America, in Europe. Oddly enough, there is conflict between the British and the French in India. The British and the French both have trading posts in India. And there's a war going on in India between the French sections and the British sections of the subcontinent of India. So I have joked sometimes that this ought to be called the First World War. And World War I is actually about World War V. So 5 and 6 in the 20th century. This is a world war. Russia, Austria, and France versus Prussia. It was called by contemporaries, the alliance between Russia, Austria, and France was the League of the Three Petticoats. Because Empress Elizabeth of Russia was allied with Maria Theresa of Austria, who's still burning from having lost Silesia. She wants it back. And the real power in France is Louis XV's mistress, Madame de Pompadour. She actually is the one who conducted the diplomacy and the alliance and issued the military orders. So it's the League of the Three Petticoats. And Frederick goes, I can take them. And he could, and he did.
You fight like girls.
You fight like girls, yeah. Prussia struck first. They attacked Saxony, August of 1756, because they're the neighbor and the Saxons are making noises about joining this league. And Frederick says, no, you're not. And overrun, he puts 25,000 men in the field and the Saxons have 2,000. He's got a 10-to-1 advantage over and just rolls right through Saxony. Victories in the first 3 years of the war, and then the tide kind of turned and he got stalemated and stalled. At the end, these other countries did have vast resources and they sort of became a war of attrition. In the end, Elizabeth of Russia died and Russia withdrew all of their troops from the battle. That is how Frederick survived and why Prussia was not defeated. There was a treaty that forced Austria to recognize Prussia's annexation of Silesia. Frederick said, that's it. Maria Theresa has to agree that it's ours and we're not giving it back and she should quit trying. And she did because she had gone even deeper into debt. After the 7 years of war, basically everybody was back to their starting points. Nobody had gained any territory from anybody. Except the British. The British got all of the French portions of their overseas colonies in North America. The British got Quebec. They got all of New France at the end of this. So the British are going, yeah, we'll let them fight it out on the continent there. We're quite happy with what we've gotten. But the colonies have gotten involved, and here's one of the connections. It ends in 1763. The British are like, it costs us a lot of money to send British regulars across the Atlantic into North America. And somehow or other, we ought to get the money back from the colonies that we had to spend to defend them. And so they start putting taxes on the colonies to pay back the war debt from this war. And the colonies are like, whoa, wait. We have our own legislatures. We didn't approve those taxes. And the British says, no, your legislatures don't count. Parliament is what counts. And the colonists are like, but we don't have any representation in Parliament. And they go, no, your colonies, we defended you. You have to pay for the war. That's the backdrop. And that doesn't really get taught in American history books, unfortunately. So here he is, again. George Washington. George Washington is a participant in the French and Indian War. And we talked about him when I gave my lecture on him. He went with the Virginia militia, with Braddock. When Braddock had a disastrous defeat, Washington was there. And Washington was... It shaped Washington's impression of the British regular army. It's like, they may be pretty good when they fight European style and the two armies line up shoulder to shoulder and fire volleys at each other, but they're no good against Indians. They're no good against people who hide behind brick wall or stone walls and trees. Washington learns. Here's Frederick, again, this is a 19th century German dramatic romantic painting. It's a picture of Frederick. He was in the thick of the battle. The Battle of Zorndorf, 1758, in that 7 Years' War, the Prussians had a setback at one point, and their lines were being pushed back and threatening to break. And Frederick went forward, picked up the colors, and led a charge in the field. So it's a well-documented story. This is not just romanticism. This is the troops were, in fact, rallied by Frederick in person in battle. So there's the King of Prussia leading his troops in the field. And that's, yes, same map shows all that. All right, Act 3, Scene 3, the Wars of Frederick. 1772, we get the partition of Poland. This is the first partition of Poland. Eventually disappears, but it still exists as a kingdom from the Middle Ages. But the king died, 1763. Everybody's jockeying over who's going to get to be king. The situation in Poland is the nobility choose their king by election. So the Duke of Saxony wants to be king. The Tsar of Russia wants to be king. There are various French princes who want to be king. There are various English princes who put themselves forward as candidates to be king. And Russia got their candidate elected. And Russia basically told Frederick, is there any part of it eastern land you'd like to take? We're going to take some of the western land. Why don't you take some of the eastern land? Or no, why don't you take some of the, we're taking the eastern land. Why don't you take some of the western land? So Prussia took territory. Russia and Austria also took territory. Here's what it looks like. This map is from the Tim Blanning book. So Austria snatched Galicia. This is where West Prussia is snatched up by Prussia, and the Russians take all of this over here along the Dnieper River. Here's Kiev, just to sort of show you how current some of these underlying things are in the background. All of this territory was taken from Germany at the end of World War II. Half of it was given to Poland. Silesia was given to Poland. The Königsberg is now Kaliningrad. It was given to the Russians. Königsberg had been the capital of Prussia. It had its own German university. There were probably several million German refugees who fled at the end of World War II, fled west into Germany. Most of them fled all the way to West Germany, to the British, American, and French sectors. One of my friends in Germany, when I was a student there, his father had come from East Prussia at the end of the war. There are whole subdivisions where the street names are taken from village names in Prussia. So the Ostsiedlung. All right, a little bit about the court in Berlin. In addition to Frederick's achieving a reputation as a battlefield commander, as a commander, which of course is ironic given his childhood and teenage rebellion, but he did become a military expert and a military leader. You wonder sometimes if it wasn't just to prove his father wrong. You know, there are grave difficulties in psychoanalyzing the dead, but yeah. So his palace is called Sans Souci because he speaks French. He thinks German is a little primitive. He supported Rousseau. He actually arranged for refuge for Rousseau a couple times when Rousseau was going to be arrested and threatened with prison. He didn't much like all of Rousseau's ideas, but he said, yes, send the guy some money. He doesn't deserve to go to prison. He had a lengthy correspondence with Berlin, with Voltaire. He invited Voltaire to Berlin in 1750, and Voltaire lived at his court for 3 years, 1750 to 1753. And then they had kind of a breakup. Friendship went bad. Voltaire wrote some nasty things about him. Frederick didn't care. 1747, Johann Sebastian Bach visited, performed for Frederick. Frederick challenged Bach. He pulled out his flute. He played a long, intricate theme called the Royal Theme, and then challenged Bach to improvise a 3-voice fugue on the piano. Bach sat down, played for about 10 minutes, an improvisation and a harmonization of a fugue going forward and backward off the top of his head. And Frederick reportedly, you can read all about that in the Frederick the Great and Bach at the court, then challenged and says, could you do a 6-part? And Bach said, I can, but not off the top of my head, but I've written down the theme. I'll send it to you after I get home. And he did. Yeah. His reputation at the end. Almost every one of his biographers, going all the way back to Carlyle with the 6th volume, praises him as a military genius. Again, this is ironic, given his childhood and teenage years. A military genius, personally courageous, resourceful, a master of tactics and planning and logistics. He knew not only how to position his army, he knew how to keep his army supplied, and he paid attention to the details. He understood what Napoleon later said, an army marches on its stomach. Frederick knew that a generation before Napoleon. Most of his biographers would describe him as an enlightened despot who is a transformative figure. He initiates religious tolerance in Prussia. He initiates judicial reforms. He abolishes serfdom, especially in the eastern territories. He was particularly concerned that justice should be equally available for all. He made sure that his nobles were not treated preferentially in the courts. And he actually funded a lot of initiatives for schools and literacy for his entire population. Now, some people say, yeah, but that might have been for the wrong reason. It was only because literate soldiers were more effective in the field. But it's still true that he left a legacy of establishing schools and offering universal education. Patron of the arts and philosophy. The overall consensus, Clark, Blanning, Showalter affirmed that Frederick deserves the great title. He elevated Prussia. He laid the foundations for later German unification. It is Prussia that pulls all of the other German territories into one state. It's the King of Prussia. After the Franco-Prussian War, where a lot of the states were kind of reluctant participants, weren't quite sure. After the Prussians annihilate the French in one summer, it's a campaign that only takes several months in 1870, and hold a victory parade in Paris, Prussian army marches down the Champs-Élysées under the Arc de Triomphe. And of course, even before that, the Battle of Waterloo is won only because the Prussian army shows up. Wellington gets all the credit, and he deserves a lot of the credit, but they only defeat Napoleon at Waterloo because the Prussian army shows up, and it's the Prussian army that had been trained, developed, drilled by Frederick and his father. His reign is seen as a high point of absolutist state building, yes, though not without moral ambiguities or contradictions. He was both a progressive reformer and a warrior king who prioritized power, but not in the sense of personal power. He prioritized increasing the power of Prussia. He wasn't really too concerned about power for himself, although he was a bit of an autocrat. It was like, no, I want Prussia to have the best army in the world. The American connection comes down to one very important name, who is mentioned in our history textbooks, but we don't always get the background. Baron von Steuben. Baron von Steuben had served under Frederick in the Prussian army in those military campaigns that I talked about, the campaigns in Silesia, the campaigns against the Austrians and the Russians. 1747 to 1763, for 16 years. In the 1760s, though, Frederick decided that it was time to downsize the army, and he discharged about 25% of his troops and officers. And von Steuben was actually laid off. He wanted to pursue a career for the rest of his life in the army, but the army, because Fritz, that was the soldier's nickname, decided we're not really going to go to war. We're going to sit on what we have. We only need enough troops to keep our borders secure. We can reduce the size of the army and the expense. So von Steuben is let go. He had risen from lance corporal to captain, so he starts as a non-commissioned officer, not quite a private. He started a little above that, and rose to captain. He fought in several of those major battles. He, in fact, became an aide-de-camp to Frederick the Great himself staff position. He became the quartermaster, not just for a battalion or a unit. He became quartermaster under Frederick for the entire Prussian army. He arranged the supplies and the supply lines of everything they needed: food, transport, gunpowder, weapons. Steuben was the one organizing the collection of all of that throughout the territory of Prussia, making sure it got to the army in the field. He attended Frederick's elite school for young officers, deputy quartermaster for the entire Prussian army. He shows up in Paris in 1777 and seeks out Benjamin Franklin. And of course, he speaks French. So does Franklin, because everybody at the court in Prussia speaks French. And Franklin immediately says, "Oh, you fought with Frederick the Great, one of the more impressive armies on the continent. We know the victories that Frederick says, and you would like to sign up?" So this is 1 year after the Declaration of Independence. Franklin sends him to the colonies, sends him to George Washington's army. He joins Washington at Valley Forge in 1778. Washington petitioned Congress to get him a commission as a major general, and he became the drill master for the Continental Army at Valley Forge. There are all sorts of wild stories told about him because his English wasn't very good. And so he would be out drilling the Continentals who, were farmers and they weren't really professional soldiers. And von Steuben is trying to whip them into shape and teach them the maneuvers and the commands of the Prussian army. And he's issuing orders in German. And when they don't follow, he starts cursing at them in German. And the American farmers are like, we don't know. He gets better. He trained the Continental Army in Prussian drill and tactics. He wrote the Manual of Arms for the Continental Army. That is the explanation of all the various maneuvers and formations that the Army needs to know how to execute and how to move from one to the other and what each soldier should do. And then he drills them so they will know what to do in a battle when they have to be deployed or redeployed or shift their front from one area to another. Von Steuben teaches them how to do that because the Prussians had learned how to do that. It's von Steuben who is responsible for the victory of Washington's army against the British. He commanded a battalion at the Siege of Yorktown in 1781. He went from being just their drill master to being having a field command under Washington. He retired, spent the rest of his life in upstate New York. He got land grants. As a result, the Continental Congress granted him land grants in the territory. He never married. Never had any children, has no descendants. He had 2 military aides that he adopted as his sons just a year before he died so that they would inherit his land. There are descendants of those guys. Died in 1794. So that's our connection to Frederick the Great. One of his officers is actually a key figure in our Revolutionary War. And what he taught our army is why they were able to defeat the British. So I hope that's been helpful. I've selected 3 more people for the spring lecture. In April, I'm going to do Lorenzo the Magnificent from Florence. In May, Albrecht Dürer, the Leonardo of the North in Nuremberg. And in June, Queen Elizabeth I, the iconic Virgin Queen, ruled England for 44 years. I think all 3 of those will be worth coming for and fun. So thank you for coming. I hope you carry away a little something about Frederick from all of this and an appreciation for how he intersected with our history. Thanks for coming.